We left off last lecture with President Kennedy being assassinated in November of 1963. And when that happens, the 25th Amendment, well, actually, President Johnson will be sworn in as president aboard Air Force One, and the 25th Amendment will be adopted later because we didn't have a constitutional amendment in place for exactly how the succession of the president will go. Johnson is a complete opposite, as I've mentioned before, from Mr. Kennedy. He is a career politician. He is a conservative. Um, he is from Texas. He's more of the country. Kennedy was definitely more urban, more city. Um, President Johnson, though, will continue President Kennedy's domestic agenda and his foreign agenda. Now, Mr. Kennedy was shot and killed in November of '63, and then he will go up for re-election in '64. So you've got about a year, in fact, a year before he's going to be reelected, and he will go, and then Mr. Johnson will run against Barry Goldwater as a very staunch conservative from that represented the Republican Party, and Mr. Johnson will easily defeat him. And when Mr. Johnson is reelected, he will continue not only Mr. Kennedy's ideas, but he will promote his own. So to go back through, Mr. Kennedy was proposing, again today would be rather conservative agenda: tax cuts, strong defense, civil rights legislation, a strong defense against the communists, and you see where I just misspelled defense. As made mention, he will defeat the Republican candidate Barry Goldwater in 1964, and then he will propose his own legislation, which will be called the Great Society. And the Great Society is going to have the belief that legislative, meaning laws by Congress, could, or the attempt was to end poverty and political injustice. And so we're going to start new programs like Medicare, which is low-cost insurance for the elderly. That was something that was being proposed by President Kennedy that was passed underneath President Johnson. And Medicaid, which is health care benefits and insurance for people of low income. We're going to do immigration reform, changing our immigration system, which we just got done taking a look at. And the Great Society and its results are, depending on which side of the aisle you're on, some had some, I don't think there's any doubt it has a lasting imprint. And some of it had some dramatic impact. For example, the poverty rate did go down from 23% in the late 1950s. It'll go as far as low as 12%. So pretty amazing results there, cutting 10%. And since then, it's gone back up to about 15 to 16%. It's pretty much hovered there ever since. Some of the other things that the Great Society does is it stops government in its overreach, specifically in the Warren Court, in the Miranda Rights Act. I think there's no question that the Great Society is the first federally funded program that gave money in large amounts to schools for increase in buying of textbooks, libraries, buying or building facilities. The negatives, or the proponents against the Great Society, would say that it cost, and the costs of the Great Society and a lot of these programs that were made kind of up as you went along were extremely high. It caused to have higher budget deficits. And again, deficits are the amount of money you're spending from fiscal beginning of the year to the end of the fiscal year. And so budget deficits during the Great Society and Johnson, they soared. And then the federal government's going to grow a great deal. They're going to have more of an influence, and their hands are going to be on more things. And if you're someone who's a conservative, you don't believe government is the answer, and so you don't like to see the government doing that. So again, there's goods and bads. You'd need to make the decision for yourself. Next, along with Mr. Johnson and Mr. Kennedy and a change, came the change within the Supreme Court and that system, and that's going to start before Mr. Kennedy's in office. That's going to start in the 1950s. A gentleman by the name of Earl Warren, who will become Chief Justice, and his time frame is 15 years in office. And the Warren Court, him being the Supreme Court justice, he is the head of the Supreme Court. Mr. Warren is an activist. Now, there's two kinds of judges. You have the constitutionalist or the originalist that says you can only do what the Constitution says you can do. And then you have the activist who says, well, what was the intent of our founders? And Warren is definitely an activist. And so let's take a look at some of the more controversial or landmark cases. In 1956, you have what's called the Brown versus the Board of Education. It's in Kansas, and that's a landmark decision because it's going to end school segregation. No longer white versus minority, white versus black schools. You're going to integrate those schools. Supreme Court's going to say you cannot do that anymore. The Warren Court is going to end school prayer. We here in the West Ada School District, when it was Meridian, I'm quite certain you would have had every day start with the announcements or in the classroom with a prayer back in the 60s. And that's going to end. That's going to be found to be unconstitutional because it goes against the Second Amendment and the state not being able to endorse a religion. And when you're saying the prayer out of the Bible, you're endorsing Christianity, and the state can't do that. So that's going to be ended during the Warren Court. Expanding free speech and the right of free speech. One of the big ones was during the Vietnam War. Students at schools were allowed to wear armbands showing their unity and dislike for the Vietnam War, and that was found to be constitutional. Another really, really big one was something that we'll get into next unit, but what's called reapportionment. And reapportionment was done on the state level by the Supreme Court, and basically what it's saying is that one person gets one vote. And I don't want to go into it too much, but basically it's this. You had districts where rural areas of a state would have far more larger impact in state elections than urban districts. And you'd have, say, one district outside of a major metropolitan area with 200,000 people, and that would be the same value as another district that might have 800,000 people. And so when doing reapportionment, they said, we're going to divide the state up where the states have to have the same amount of votes. A couple other landmark cases is Mapp versus Ohio. And this is a court case in, oh gosh, when was Mapp? Mapp is 1961, I believe. And basically what it said was no longer can the police search and grab something out of your car unless they have a proper warrant. So if you find evidence in a crime scene and you've gone in there without a warrant, and it breaks the law, the parameters of what you can and can't do, then the Supreme Court said, no, any evidence that you get in that instance, it's going to get thrown out and it can't be used in the court to convict the guy. Another one, landmark one, was Miranda versus Arizona, which is 1966. And what happened there was a gentleman was brought in on a charge and was never read his rights. And the Supreme Court came back and said that a person being arrested must be informed of his rights, his constitutional rights. So the right to remain silent, the right to have an attorney present when being questioned, the right to know what you're being charged with. And they had not had that up until that time. And that, again, it's a huge case that changes the courts and how we go about in our law enforcements. Now, you may still you may arrest somebody. You can be arrested, guys, and brought in, and you don't need to be read your rights. They can detain you for up to 24 hours, and if they don't read you your right or charge you with anything, you can say something and it can't be used against you. So that's why almost immediately, every single time when someone's arrested, they're read their rights, because after that point, anything you say, as they say when they read your Miranda rights, is anything you say can and will be used against you. But if you've been detained and you haven't been actually charged with a crime, and you say out loud something that's damning to you, and then later on we charge you with it, you can't have that used against you in a court. So that was changed with Miranda. Now, the downside, or the people that are against the Warren Court, especially when it came to criminal rights, feel like in the 60s and 70s that the pendulum had swung completely away from civil justice and order to protecting the criminal. And there's a bunch of people that get very, very upset. And it's a very, very effective tool used by the Republicans against the Democrats in the 70s and 80s, when they say, you or whoever that politician would say you are in favor of being too soft on crime. And if I'm elected, I'm going to do such and such. And today, we've come to just simply accept it. But there was about a 15, 20-year period where it was a very controversial to have the ruling of Mapp and Miranda. So let's stop there. And we've now done an article looking at the immigrant and immigration reform. And now we've taken a look at the Great Society and some of the programs that Mr. Johnson and Mr. Kennedy installed. And now we've had a lecture on Mr. Johnson. So now we're going to go into the civil rights era and what was done during that time frame. We'll be taking a look at Mr. King and what was done during that, and some of the other activists during that time frame.